we've seen Ukraine's use of initiative to achieve pretty good results in the past and striking at the right place at the right time using deception. They've certainly been very clever, and so I certainly wouldn't underestimate the chance of a Ukrainian offensive. But equally, there are lots of obstacles in the way, quite literally in the case of these defensive lines. Though I think if you look, Ukraine's been given a huge amount of combat engineering equipment to overcome these obstacles and pushed its way through. So I think it's far from guaranteed that this will just be a sort of reverse of the Russian offensive with Ukraine grinding away and gaining very little. I don't think they'll be able to land a blow decisive enough to end the conflict. I think from the Western point of view, Ukrainian occupation of Crimea has always been discussed as potentially something of a red line where Russia might feel it could use nuclear weapons. I think it's one of the only areas within Ukraine where that's kind of felt to be a realistic threat. I mean, Russia chucks a nuclear threat around very often, as we've seen during the conflict. But I think this is one of the areas they might really feel that Russian territory is being impinged. That's uncertain to be the case, but I think there is this sort of feeling that that's a very decisive blow at the Russians compared to the fighting, say, in the Donbass or elsewhere, or in Zaporizhia, or as we've seen, I mean, Russia gave up half of Kherson and pulled back across the river because it had to. So there are losses the Russians will take, and there are losses they probably won't take. One of the strategies the Ukrainians have is to close on Crimea, though, to put Crimea under threat, to be able to bring missile systems in range of all the bases in Crimea and sort of threaten to make it untenable for Russia without actually setting foot on the peninsula, which does have some military challenges. You've got to get through a small bottleneck that is well defended. You've got to get to that bottleneck, and then you've got to fight through. And the German army knows from experience quite how difficult it is to take Crimea and Sevastopol. So, I mean, that is a big ask. I think threatening Crimea is more possible. And I think if they can bring Crimea within missile range, if they can close the Kerch Strait again, they can effectively isolate Crimea. And that's a very, very useful point in negotiations, potentially, if both sides come more serious about stopping the conflict, on their calculation, whether or not they can outlast the other. But I think for Russia, having Crimea become much more untenable would be a problem. And I think that's something that would be very effective for the Ukrainians. So I think rather than the reconquest, it's that ability effectively to threaten Crimea, to cut Crimea off from the other forces. And that's one of the reasons the Russians have looked so hard towards Zaporizhia and put so many lines of defense in southern Kherson, in Zaporizhia, on the Crimean bottleneck, and the access on to Crimea to counter that threat. So it's certainly something that Russia is very aware of and Russia is very worried about. I think the quality of manufacture of a lot of the defensive positions is pretty poor. We saw that in Kherson. I think a lot of the obstacles that have been laid out haven't been laid out very effectively. And if Ukraine, again, using the combat engineering equipment, maneuver support equipment they've been given in very large numbers, can break through some of these. And of course, fixed defenses become a problem. The Iraqi army discovered that during Desert Storm. Once you break through positional defenses, the troops that are in them are trapped in them. They can't then retreat. They are stuck in the lines that they're in. And actually, if the enemy has got through and is in their rear areas, then that's a very large problem for you. And you just have lots of people who are isolated and surrounded, cut off potentially from supply, and with no one coming to help. You're not going to see a spectacular result finish the conflict. I think it is set to drag on, as many wars do, until such point as people eventually realize that they can't gain more by fighting. And of course, that Russian strategy, I think, will remain to absorb whatever whatever Ukraine throws at them now, soak it up, and try and hold on to the land and create a stalemate. But it's very clear that they're now shifting onto that defensive posture in general. Russian media coverage talks about their preparations to face down the offensive. So if nothing else, the Ukrainians have successfully talked the Russians into digging in where they are rather than continuing their own offensive. So that's already a partial success. We just remains to be seen now just quite how much Ukraine can achieve and quite how scared that makes the Russian military for the future.